Okay, now that we've talked about the major scales, we've talked about the minor scales, we've talked about major and minor intervals and perfect fourths and perfect fifths, intervals, interval of an octave. I'm going to give you an example of how you're going to see these intervals notated. So, in order to build a chord, I have to have certain notes in that chord. Now, if you only have two notes, that's not a chord, that's an interval, right? Even though a power chord only has two notes. But really, if you're going to have a chord that can be notated as major or minor, then you have to have at least three notes, and that's called a triad. So if we want to build a G7 chord, very common chord, right? G7, also known as a dominant seventh, you're going to have to know what intervals you need in that chord in order to build up that seventh chord. So if I'm going to build up a G7 chord, let's say I didn't have a clue how to play a G7 chord, but I saw on the notation that said G7, and I knew my major and minor scales, and I knew my intervals, I could build that G7th chord. Okay, and here's how I would do that. I know that if the chord is a G chord, it has to have the note G in it, right? So what I would do is I would build up that chord beginning with G. Or what notes do I need in order to have a G7 chord? Or G7 means a G dominant seventh, okay? And you'll see that written just with G and the number 7 next to it. What notes do I need? I need the G. I need the third. I could need the fifth. I could leave that out. But I'm definitely going to have the seventh. So count up with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Right? That's my major seventh. So there's my seventh. But a G dominant seventh has a flat 7, and that's the thing you're going to have to know. If it says G7, that means a G dominant seventh. If it says a G major seventh or a G7 plus, that means a G major seventh, which would be, but a G dominant seventh is going to have a flat 7, so I need to lower this note a half step. Okay, and then all I got to do is put my third in there. There's my G dominant seventh. I could also play it with the fifth, but I have to have that seventh. Now I could also extend it all the way to right? Because, and we haven't talked about what a bar chord is, but basically this is a G major chord with a flat 7. There's my flat 7. Now if I was just looking at a chord in a piece of music that just said G7, I really wouldn't know what exact notes were in it, but I would know that it would have to have the G and it would have to have a flat 7 in order for it to be a dominant 7th chord. So you can see how intervals are so important. Let me give you another example. Let's say that it said a G7 sus4, S-U-S-4. What does that mean? Well, sus is short for suspended, and 4 is the fourth. So if it says G7 with a suspended fourth, and I didn't have a clue how to play that chord, I could build it up using intervals. How would I go about doing that? Well, I'd have to have the G, right? If I count up to the fourth, what's the fourth in G? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so now I know it has to have G and it has to have C, because C is the fourth in G, and I know it has to have the 7th, right? So basically that would be my G7 with a suspended fourth, which would probably resolve or go to the next chord it would probably go to is, right, from 4 down to 3. So let me give you another example of how you could build up a chord. Let's say it said G7 7 with a major 9. Okay, what's a ninth? Well, if we count up 1, 2, 2 in the key of G is A. If I count up, if I add 7 to 2, I get 9, right? So if I go from G to A, that's a major second. But if I add 7 to that, I come up with 9. So a major ninth in the key of G is, well, let's count up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I know that this chord has to have the ninth. It has to have the seventh, which we figured out was, right? Did I say G7, 9? I think I did. Let's pretend I did. So G7, 9 is going to sound like this. Okay? So it has the G in it, it has a flat 7, and it has a ninth. Right? If it had the 11th, let's count up. If it said G7, 11, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So here's my 11th. I still need the G. I still want my 7th. So a G7, 11 would sound like this. That might resolve down to, right? But the point is, once you understand intervals, you can basically build any chord that you see, because there are, I don't know if infinite is the right word, but there are thousands and thousands and thousands of chords, and you're not going to memorize them all. But once you understand intervals and you understand the scales, then anytime you come across a chord that you don't necessarily know by heart or from memory, you can create that chord using intervals.